Welcome, everybody. Now, this is called, in the programme, Scotland's Role in the World. We're lucky enough to have with us the SNP's defence spokesman, Angus Robertson, MP for Moray, one of the finest parts of this country. So Kieran, of course, is a diplomat of immense experience, both in the British interest and working for international organisations, notably the UN, one of our most seasoned diplomats. Urko brings a perspective, of course, from Spain and from the Basque country, which is very interesting on the question of Scotland and our future relationships with our neighbour, if it comes to that, or indeed the EU. And Jeremy Purvis, of course, brings, a local political knowledge of the borders, but also a Liberal Democrat voice, clearly, alongside Angus. So, you know, Scotland's role in the world sounds a little vague and woolly, so let's try to make it rather specific. Angus Robertson, whether to be a yes vote, this is not an argument about the referendum, it's an argument about Scotland, right? If there were to be a yes vote, what kind of Scotland, in terms of its relationships with the rest of the existing UK and Europe and the world, would you like to see?
Well, the question you pose is the reason I went into politics. I'm one of those people who's a bit hither and thither, like so many other people in Scotland. I'm from elsewhere, so I was born in London, I'm half German. You can be as,
I mean, it's a private audience, you can be as confessional as you like. It's quite all right.
I'm trying to explain that for me, the dimension of being a bit from here, being a bit from there, where does one fit in, individually or as a nation, was the reason why I went into politics in the first place. Having done a journey of, I speak a couple of languages, I feel comfortable here and I feel comfortable there, then asking myself during the 1980s, what kind of country is Scotland? The country I support at football and rugby, playing badly at both of those still. But asking myself why we're represented by a government in the world that we didn't elect. And then having a look and think about that and travelling to other countries and then wondering why other countries seem to manage, or Scotland's size, seem to manage to play a positive role in the world. So that's the background to what I think is one of the really tremendously exciting prospects of a yes vote, which is that Scotland can rejoin the family of nations directly, so unmediated through governance in London. Now, of course, one could be very proactive, one can be a force for good, one can wish to support international development, one can want to support peace and reconciliation, and maybe we can come back to all of those themes, which are things that I would like Scotland to see do. But of course, one could, of course, choose not to be tremendously engaged. Independence doesn't guarantee that one party's in government that has one particular view, one set of priorities, but my priorities would be engaged, internationalist. We are living in an interdependent age, and I would like to see Scotland being a part of that European and global community.
Would you like to see Scotland as an independent member of NATO and nuclear alliance?
I would like to see Scotland remain within NATO, yes. I think, given our really important geostrategic situation, we have the North Atlantic to our west, the North Sea to our east, the Iceland Gap to our north, the clues in the name, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and as you know, and I know there's some visitors in the audience who are not from Scotland, so perhaps it would be helpful to explain that I helped change the SNP's policy on this question last year. Previously, our position was that we wanted to remain in a partnership arrangement with NATO, and I argued that it was important for us to be a full member, playing in our part in that.
So to be clear, if anyone wants to vote yes, on the grounds that they'll get rid of the Trident boats from the Clyde and it will be a non-nuclear Scotland, they might as well forget about the SNP.
Well, people can make up their own mind. The point I was trying to make before, Jim, is an independent Scotland is not going to be a Scotland governed by the SNP forever. We would win a referendum, the yes side, in 2014, negotiate and transition to being a sovereign state in 2016, and at that point the electorate of Scotland would determine who they wish the government to be.
Fine. Jeremy Purvis, you presumably adhere to a kind of Gladstonian Home Rule idea for Scotland. Why, in your view, is the attraction of what Angus Robertson says about Scotland's ability to be a country that's engaged on its own terms with international organisations not one that we should go for, that we should stop short of that? Why is that not attractive enough?
So I actually think a lot of what Angus said I share with. The question for me is whether or not statehood is the thing that brings that about. And if you think of one of the contributions that we can make, statehood can come many levels down from part of what we can offer the world. And we, Scotland, with 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, can actually have a much bigger impact across the way of governance, of some of the whole positive nature that we can provide. When it comes to what the statehood would then bring, I think that then that comes a rational discussion as to, well, whether or not part of the United Kingdom does provide us with our ability then to have a greater say for that. And ultimately, for that side, it's a pragmatic decision that should be taken. Mm-hmm. I think that as far as some of the positive contributions we can make, sometimes I think it's a distraction to be looking at that. If you think of one of the things, I just spent an hour and a half with a group of Bahraini young people talking about governance and sharing power. And actually, when we were talking about a history, our perspective, the role that the borders has played on exporting people, on exporting ideas, it came down the line that we talked about independence. And it wasn't the top reason why we have to be there to be talking about some of the things that's important in the world.
Well, we'll tease out these two because it's two interesting opening statements. Urko, from a Basque point of view, from Spain, how does this argument look, looking in on it?
Well, I think that, first of all, it would be very pretentious for me to talk about the role of Scotland in the world.
No, but
it's on the hands of the Scottish and what they want and what they can. But what amazes to me is the role that Scotland is playing right now, and the process, the success of dealing with the national question that has happened here, and not only in Scotland, but how has been dealt by the United Kingdom, by the British government.
Yeah. You mean particularly the agreement, for example, in 2012?
And we are talking about an issue, the national question, that has been a bloody issue in all the 20th century. Yes. And what we are seeing here in Scotland, and for me that's the successful story, is not the outcome of the referendum. The outcome will be whatever the Scottish want.
I mean, in a sense,
it's the process.
In a sense, what you're saying is that the agreement that was reached between David Cameron and Alex Salmond was a form of conflict resolution.
It was a conflict prevention.
Yes.
It was a conflict prevention.
It's easy to underestimate it, actually, isn't it? I mean, do you agree with that, Angus? That I'm going to bring Kieran in a second on this.
Absolutely. I think we in Scotland, we in the UK, underestimate the degree to which the process that's currently going on is being looked on from outside with wonder, that we are deciding the future of Scotland, and we're doing it at colloquium events, we're doing it over the dining room table, we're discussing it with our friends. That's where it's happening. There are other parts of the world where the national question, the nature of democracy, unfortunately, the democratic route is difficult. In some places, it's not open to people. But here we're having, we're having a debate about something, and then it is the people who will decide. And both the UK government and the Scottish governments have agreed to that path.
I don't want to pour any cold water on what you're saying, because I agree with it all, and I think I think any fair-minded person would accept exactly what you've said. There is some concern that people, not emphatically not you and not Alex Salmond, when things get rough, as they may well do towards Easter, will start getting quite nasty. And there'll be words like traitor thrown around. Now, what do people like you do if it starts to get ugly, given what you've just said?
Well, first off, I take every opportunity, which is why in my opening statement I talked about why I came to the conclusion that I have my personal story, and I can vouch for all of the people I know at the front of the moves for Scottish sovereignty, sharing those democratic, inclusive principles. It's unfortunately a factor of public life now, and the likes of Facebook and Twitter have accelerated this reality that when you represent a point of view, unfortunately there are those who disagree with you who choose to use intemperate language. Now, I currently receive those messages.
Of course, I'm sure you do.
And no doubt there are people who are on the other side of the argument
Yes,
in this
yes.
debate who also receive messages which are...
But it's important for people in public life to say this won't do, isn't it?
Of course it is, and that's why I'm
Yes.
happy to drive 4.5 hours to the borders to come to an event like this
Exactly.
to make the point
'Cause it's the kind
that
of-
we are engaged in something which is really special.
Yeah.
And was it Bill Clinton? Maybe
Yes.
I'm choosing the wrong international statesman. Or it was Mary Robinson, perhaps even both
Yes.
of them, who made the point that what is happening is tremendously exciting in Scotland.
Yes.
That we are having a democratic debate about a civic, non-ethnic, democratic choice.
And it needs to be carried out at a
and
decent
it needs to be
level.
carried out on the level of here's one view, here's the other
Yeah.
view, and we will come to the conclusion, and that's the level that it should happen at.
Fine.
Absolutely right.
Thank you very much. Right, now, Kieran Prendergast, I want to bring you in this because an interesting point was made, and it was a sort of divide, a very civilised divide between Jeremy and Angus on this. And it's the question of whether statehood matters in terms of influence. Angus's point was that an independent Scotland, or a sovereign Scotland to use your terminology, would be able to sort of decide its destiny and its values and the way it conducted itself in the international arena in a different way, because it wouldn't have to do it through the aegis of a UK government. From your perspective as an international diplomat of long experience, is there a difference between statehood of that kind, that is very obvious, and the sort of influence that is exerted by a UK, which would be weaker as a consequence of a sovereign Scotland?
I'm not sure I know the answers to the question. It's more a philosophical question than a practical question. When I look at Britain at the moment, and I look at the presence and influence of Scots, I mean, some of my ambassadors were Scottish, heads of the foreign service were Scottish. You look at leading political figures on the United Kingdom scene. How many ministers, how many leading Labour politicians, for example, were Scottish? We've had a number of Scottish prime ministers. What happens if there is a separate Scotland? Do we not have any more Scottish prime ministers of the United Kingdom? Does that increase Scotland's net influence, or does it diminish it? I also wonder tactically whether the threat of a referendum wasn't a more potent lever to increase Scottish influence within the United Kingdom than the fact of a referendum. You know, when one looks at other things like sanctions or the use of force, frequently the threat of sanctions is more effective than the fact of sanctions when they're finally imposed, or the threat of the use of force can achieve more than the actual
You mean the fact
force.
of the referendum might get Scotland more in the long run without all the anxiety of having
Well,
to
I
write
think
a treaty afterwards?
the threat of a referendum can leverage
Yeah.
quite a lot. What happens if you lose a referendum? I mean, you've lost your leverage as well.
There's
you
a-
can't keep doing a sort of Quebec and have a referendum every 10 years or every
No, it's right.
20. So for me, that's a tactical issue. It's not a substantive issue. And the other one is a philosophical issue, and not one that you can very easily quantify.
No.
But if you had to quantify it, you could quite well argue that there would be less influence if you you wouldn't be on the Today programme anymore, would you? Because you would have to apply for
Oh
a
yes,
work.
I would.
A work.
That's been taken
You'd be
care
an
of.
alien. You'd be a resident alien.
No. Well, I don't think that. I'm sure Angus could reassure us on these matters.
Can I?
I'll do that in private if you don't mind. From a Spanish point of view, looking at it from the Basque country, but obviously we know the Catalonian argument too. Do you think that there is an expectation that the kind of process that we're undergoing in this country is the way of the next generation, or not?
I think that there is an expectation on being the way of the next generation. But the Spanish government has been very clear
Yes.
in that sense. In a statement, the Foreign Affairs Minister said clearly, Spain is not United Kingdom. We've got a clear constitution, but they don't have.
No.
And the Spanish constitution said clearly that the Spain is a unitarian state, indivisible state, and that the duty of the army is to maintain this unity. So, no doubt, no space for the debate.
No space for the debate. And Angus Robertson, of course, when it comes to the consequences of a potential yes vote and accession talks with the EU, the Spanish government are going to be quite a tough nut to crack for you, because if they accept a fast-track basis on the grounds that you are, in effect, a continuing state, that opens the door to Barcelona and indeed to San Sebastian.
No, I don't think it does, and for a number of different reasons. First off, as we just heard, the Spanish foreign minister has already said that the situation in Scotland, the UK, is fundamentally different to that in Spain.
Yeah.
For the reasons that you outlined at the beginning, there's an agreement between the Scottish government and the UK government, Article 30 of which commits both governments to respect the result of the referendum and then to progress the wish
But that doesn't
of
on
the
its
majority.
own, Angus, change the politics
Well,
of the
it does.
EU.
If I can just get on to the second point, which is, and it's an important part, which is, of this discussion, which is sadly lost in a lot of the coverage, which is that the referendum will take place in the autumn of 2014. Should there be a yes vote? Scotland will still be part of the United Kingdom. It is not about a unilateral declaration of independence. It is about an 18-month period of transition described by the UK's legal advisor as being realistic. That is, the transition of
Professor
Scotland.
Black.
It is Professor Crawford.
Sorry.
Who advised the UK government that the transition period, while Scotland is within the UK, is at the point at which the discussions of the European Union with NATO, the WTO, and all these international organisations should take place. So Scotland would transition from within the UK to a position of being a sovereign state in all of these important international organisations. That is explicitly not the case in Spain.
No. Okay, yes.
Where, just to clarify, I think that the position of the government, Spanish government, is clear that because of the independence of Scotland will be a consequence of a compromise and an agreement between the United Kingdom and Scotland, they will not oppose to this decision.
Correct.
Well, that's very clarifying. Thank you. I just want to ask you one question at this point, because you raise a fundamental aspect of the timetable, which is a yes vote would produce, well, at least as it is envisaged, an 18-month, roughly speaking, period during which an agreement would be drawn up, with Westminster, of course, having the final say. I mean, in the sense that it's bound to, it's a UK matter. What does a voter who has voted yes and who has discovered that he or she is the one, it's 50% plus one, let's just take that, and the one voter who's made the difference sits down after the 18 months and takes a look at the document and says, I don't like that. That is not a very good deal. I thought when I voted yes that we were actually going to, there would be a better division of the spoils. And I'm afraid we've lost out in this negotiation. There's nothing on earth that he or she can do about it. Isn't that right?
Well, and the equal and opposite is true, of course, as
So
well.
the answer is yes.
And, well, yeah, a matter that is a matter for negotiations, you don't know what the end of the negotiations are going to
So
be.
it's a pig in a tartan poke.
But it's important. I wouldn't describe it as,
No,
as
okay,
being that.
right,
Well,
fine.
here's one of the shock horror observations about the scenario that you're talking about. It is in the interests of the rest of the United Kingdom to come to a fair and appropriate agreement with the Scottish Government on behalf of the people of the rest of the United Kingdom, just as it is for Scotland. Again, sometimes lost in translation, Scotland is very important to the rest of the United Kingdom as a trading partner. We're a larger trading partner than China, India, Russia and Brazil combined to the rest of the United Kingdom, incidentally, as is the Irish Republic. We share the same island. The proposition that will be put to the people in the referendum will be not a 19th century autarkic vision and this is where I do find this description of separate. Now we're talking about open borders, the same head of state, sharing the same currency, but with our
To which
parliament.
your former leader, Gordon Wilson, says that's not independence.
Well, he can have that view. I disagree with him. That's fine. We're a democratic party. No problem with that. But I think it's important to understand the proposition is that we should always have the government we elect, Our Parliament should be able to determine all of the policies that matter. I agree there have been plenty people from Scotland originally who've played a role in the rest of the United Kingdom, but at the present time, Scots at Westminster are only constituted by 4% of the representation. 4%. That means that we have periods when we have governments we don't elect, we have people making decisions who are not answerable to the electorate here. That is not a normal democracy. With a sovereign situation, after a yes vote, we will always have the government we elect working as grown-ups with our neighbours, because it's in all our interests to do so, in the context of an interdependent world. That is what all other countries in the world consider to be normal. I just wish Scotland to be a normal functioning democracy.
Okay, Jeremy, why not?
I think part of while that was less than convincing from my perspective, is that it seems as if quite a lot of this is being made up as we go along with regards to how we currently form what the new Scottish state would be, but just make sure that it's a slightly more popular and tactically positioned state, rather than actually what, when I was in the Parliament for 8 years, I was absolutely assured that we would inherit all of the international treaty obligations that we would be. It was inconceivable that we would have to apply for membership of any of these. Now we do have to apply. It was inconceivable that we would have to share a currency. Now we're being told that the pound is as Scottish, or the Bank of England is as Scottish as anything else because a Scot happened to establish it. Well, a Scot established the US Navy, but I don't think that the Scottish government saying is that that is equal powers for us. I think part of the difficulty is that when we look at what our role will be in the world, all of this that Angus is presenting seems to be relevant up until September the 18th. And I get the impression that there's a lack of interest on September the 19th if Scotland chooses to stay as part of the United Kingdom. What introduced me into politics and what I like is actually what is more long-standing. Yes, our offer is showing how we can have a democratic and peaceful plebiscite which will decide on whether or not we have a separate state to match our nationhood. But equally, I'm interested on September the 19th, if Scotland does decide to stay part of the United Kingdom, then our offer is even strongest. When I was on the Education Committee in the Scottish Parliament, we had a visit by a Chinese delegation of ministers, and one of the things that struck me was when he was speaking to our Education Minister, and he was asking, he basically said that there were the same number of young people going into undergraduate education in China that year than was the entire population of Scotland. And I just was thinking, well, what will be our role within the world? Now, Angus is saying we will have some form of hybrid confederate Scotland within the UK. We'll have all of the levers of government apart from the currency, interest rates, the head of state, other international obligations that come with that. And it seems to be a slight abdication of what actually are the real challenges when we look at the globe and the opportunities going forward. And when we actually have got much more to sell, which is actually part of this collective which we've gained from our Welsh and our Northern Ireland and our English partners.
And isn't it true, Angus, that a currency union, and we can see the arguments in Europe at the moment, tends to lead to a political union? So you could be in the odd situation, having championed the euro for a long time, and the famous ambition to join the arc of prosperity that ran from Dublin to Reykjavik, which we don't hear much about now, that you could be having a common currency with the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee setting interest rates for Scotland. And you would then be forced into a position where you'd be looking for a political union with a country from which you had just gained sovereignty.
No.
Why not?
Because for a number of different reasons. One, our economy is much more in sync, so the forces that have caused the problem in the Eurozone aren't apparent in the same way. But your comparison with Northern Europe is an interesting one, and we are talking about Scotland and the world. So if you don't mind, I'll
do that.
I can segue into that to give you a qualitative example of where I see the necessity of Scotland having the powers of statehood to be able to progress our own and our wider neighbourhood's interests in the way that we should. All of our neighbouring countries in Northern Europe, so the Danes, the Norwegians, the Icelanders and others, consider the changes to the Arctic and High North to be one of the most important policy priorities that we are facing in Northern Europe. My constituency is further north than Copenhagen. So it is very relevant to Scotland as it is to Denmark or Norway or these other northern European countries. It is frankly not even on the radar screen of the UK. Why do I know that? It's not mentioned once in the UK government Strategic Defence and Security Review. A British Prime Minister was not in Norway for 25 years. The UK is not taking part in important maritime and military commitments in Northern Europe. The only NATO member state asked to provide fast jet cover from Reykjavik and declined to do so. So our neighbours are saying, here are the challenges, these are the ecological challenges, these are the security challenges, these are the foreign policy challenges that we need to work together to deal with appropriately. And the UK does not consider that to be a high enough priority to take as seriously as our neighbours do. I cannot conceive of a Scottish government of whatever political persuasion coming to a conclusion that we should do anything other than take these challenges as seriously as our neighbours do. So there's a very practical example of why a sovereign Scotland of 5 million, smaller than many other countries in the world, just the same size as Denmark, just the same size as Norway, with the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world and doing rather nicely. Those are the challenges that we should be dealing with and working with our neighbours appropriately. The UK has not taken them seriously.
Kieran Prendergast, does that make sense?
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. You can. I don't know. I don't know that these governments are asking Scotland they're going to support independence in the referendum. Maybe they are, but I'm not aware of it.
So you're not convinced that there's a great benefit
well,
for Scots?
Well, unfortunately, Jim, I know more about, say, Turkey than I know about
Norway.
Than I know about the United Kingdom, for that matter. I do know that the English are a very irritating race.
And if there were a yes vote, they might become even more irritating.
Well, there's not a good enough reason, though, to go for independence, in my view. When I was a British diplomat, I frequently had to explain that to foreigners that while everyone who was English was British, not everyone who was British was English. And there was some confusion. And, for example, in Turkish, the word for British is Ingiltere, or Ingilis, which I found immensely irritating. I'm slightly baffled by the debate, to be honest, as I say, coming from a position of considerable ignorance, because I do work a bit with the Kurds, and if you look at the Kurds, the Kurds would give their eye teeth to have arrangements such as the Welsh and the Scottish and the Northern Irish already have, and for them, it is a question fundamentally not of separation but of identity. Acceptance of identity, and I think that's happened already, hasn't it? Surely in the United Kingdom, I watched the England-Scotland match on television the other night, and I can assure you that
that's not
it was a very identifiable Scottish presence and will and all the rest of it. So the question for me is: do you have to be a separate sovereign country in order to express that identity?
Well, this touches on a very interesting question, because, without being too dogmatic about this, most movements that succeed in getting an agreement to separate or have their own sovereignty from a mother state come about, I think historically we could say this, as a result of a sort of long-standing grievance or a feeling that identity has been suppressed, that it needs to be able to flower, all that kind of thing. But it seems to me the argument that's coming from the leadership of the SNP now is not that, really. It's saying, yes, it would be nice for us to feel that identity had full reign, but it's actually a very practical argument that you're making. You're saying, no, we can have a better economy, we could have better relations with Norway and Iceland on the question of the North Atlantic. And in that sense, it's a very unusual bid for sovereignty, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So it's not a fundamental argument about, a historical grievance that's been going on for generations. Right. That's not your argument.
It's not the argument at all, and that's why Sir Kieran is, with the greatest respect, on the identity question is wrong. Yeah, we can flourish in whichever identity we have, and so many of us here have hyphenated identities of being Scottish, British, Anglo-Scottish,
London-born,
Scottish,
half
London-born, half German, whatever we are. So it's not an identity question. It may be for some people.
Yes.
But I think that the debate, and this is where I think this debate is relevant to the rest of the world. It is about better governance. It is about how do we make decisions. Do we think that it's a good idea to have a parliament making decisions on our behalf where often we don't elect the government that might make a decision that the overwhelming majority of people disagree with, say the Iraq War. Now, in normal democracies, so Germany, for example, they decided that they didn't want to take part in the Iraq War, and they didn't. People in Scotland, people in Scotland did not support the Iraq War, but young servicemen and women from Scotland were sent
Jeremy,
to a war that we considered to be illegal.
Jeremy.
The Scottish Parliament passed a resolution in support of the Iraq War. I voted against it, but the Parliament passed it. So it was obviously non-binding because it was a involved issue. It's this slightly phony argument, I think, to say that because you send political representatives to a UK institution, they are somehow incapable of expressing views of Scotland, and therefore Scotland is also incapable of saying, but we also recognise that our Welsh and our English colleagues may also have a view on this as well. It is this kind of, we are exclusively pure with some of the decisions that we make. And of course, I'm not just saying that, it's now, yes, Scotland's saying that, because they used to have that view about the head of state and the currency and on NATO, and if we heard anything from the previous contribution from General Jackson at the back, was actually the real world doesn't operate like that. And one of the, I think, the really wonderful things actually about the Union over the last 300 years, which is hardly ever talked about, is the fact that we could be celebrating the fact that for 300 years there has been nations who have constantly compromised on political decisions, but retained strong national identities that we have not been afraid of when, whether it's John Kerr, who's head of the Foreign Office, was able to say in any meetings, I'm a Scot. I'm also representing the United Kingdom. And when I was very green and brand new MSP, and I used to work for David Steele when David Steele was the presiding officer, the Kuwaiti ambassador visited Edinburgh. And at the time, this is 2002, and he said, David, I don't understand why you want a Scottish Parliament, because you have a Scottish Chancellor of the Exchequer, a Scottish Lord Chancellor, a Prime Minister who claims he's Scottish, a Speaker of the House of Commons, he's Scottish. He said, why do you want a Scottish Parliament? You're running Britain. But actually, what he didn't understand was the fact that having a degree of self-governance on some of the areas for a home rule, whether or not it's that language or Devo Plus, which I'm more comfortable with federalism, is actually a very strong gift to the world. About, as Kieran, I agree entirely with Kieran, and part of when you think of where the challenges are in the future, border dispute areas, political disagreements, intrastates, and then actually then how that grows to become more geopolitical. Our stronger message is not how we peacefully break up a union, is actually how you can make unions work politically whilst retaining identity and very strong, proud cultures.
At that point, we've done very well, and it was going so well I didn't want to open it up too early. But can we just get 2 or 3 questions before we close? Yeah, right at the back. I think it is general. Yes, Mike, you can have a response.
Yeah, I'm afraid it is, but it just on a point of fact, I think it was said that there's been no military connections in the north of Europe.
I didn't say that.
Am I wrong?
You are wrong. I didn't say there have been none. I was talking about the fast jet air policing from Iceland, which the UK has refused to take part in.
I can assure you, for what it's worth, particularly where Norway is concerned, that the military connections are very close indeed.
They are. And they are, absolutely, you're right, except the UK now doesn't have a single maritime patrol aircraft to liaise with the Norwegians when dealing with the arrival of boats or planes from our friends in the north. And I think that's suboptimal. All of our neighbouring nations, whether they're Danes, whether they're Norwegians, goodness, whether they're even the Irish Republic, have more maritime patrol aircraft than the UK currently does. And I don't think that's good enough. I think we should take our responsibilities seriously.
I think that's a completely different issue, which revolves around the size of the UK defence budget and the way it is spent.
Indeed it does, and its priorities. And they've chosen to spend up to £100 billion on Trident nuclear weapons and chosen not to have maritime patrol aircraft.
One here, and then down here at the front. Oh, whoever gets it first. Yeah, you carry on here, and then there.
How would the panel feel that the Tartan angels of the past would vote for the
Tartan
future?
angels of the past?
Yes.
Who are they? I mean...
Well, if you have Burns and Scott, they may well actually vote on different grounds, but that's actually part of the joy. But I'm not sure who the Tartan angels would
Well, yes, it'd be a motley crew.
Which, to some extent, reinforces my point.
The Scots are quite disputatious, so we would the Tartan Angels would probably be having a lively debate about it. I think is probably what would happen.
Yes, I think Walter Scott would be having a debate about it. He would know. But anyway, yes,
like
up
a
here.
transgender
Right.
band.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I speak as a Scot living in the world. This is Scotland in the world. I live in Pakistan. I'm from the borders. I'm Scots by nationality. I'm a British citizen, so I'm both. Huh.
Yes.
Okay. Now I live out there, and I'm part of the Department for International Development, doing response to the floods and so on, which have happened there. Every year, there's about 5 million people. Population of Scotland have been displaced and lost their homes. To give you an extent of the sort of damages, and we're by far the largest response organisation rebuilding homes and communities and so on. And I'm aware, while doing that if there was a separate Scotland and Britain arrangement, our capacity to deliver improved livelihoods, resilience to future climate change and so on would be greatly reduced just because we'd have less money. It's very important there to be a strong seat at the table with the World Bank, the government of Pakistan and USAID and all this lot. And I feel that by being part of Britain, I would err towards the fact that we have a platform which Scottish invention, creativity and integrity and so on can influence great change. But I'm aware that should it be a greatly reduced budget, we may be less able to do that.
Yeah. Well, were there to be a smaller budget, then I would share your concerns, but I don't believe that's an inevitable consequence. I would simply observe that the UK signed up to a 0.7% commitment to international aid a year after I was born in 1970 and hasn't delivered on that promise in one single year since. There are a number of other countries that have managed. The Norwegians have managed, the Swedes have managed, the Danes have managed, the Dutch have managed, and the Luxembourgs have managed. Smaller countries can make contributions. We can choose to organise how we do our work, and no doubt you're making a tremendous impact on the ground in Pakistan. The question is, how can we do better? And I think smaller countries can make a large contribution relative to their size, and the examples I've given you have shown that that is the case. I'm pleased that the UK is moving towards its 0.7% target, but for 40 years, it hasn't. And that's not good enough.
We've got a last, two quick ones, if you keep them short. One here, and then the lady on the aisle and towards the back.
Thanks very much. It's really a question particularly for Jeremy, but for the others. Jeremy, when he was MSP in the Borders, did a huge amount to champion renewable energy. And I'm interested in whether, given that Scotland has got the most stringent carbon reduction targets in the world, whether he isn't more interested in seeing Scotland develop as a pilot for being a renewable energy independent country, given that they've already taken major steps towards that.
Well, I certainly think there's opportunity for that, but I think it's one area where we can show that we lead, and there's a number of areas, and I think of maybe a couple of the areas where we can be very distinct, not only on the creative sector and the creative industry, which is flourishing within Scotland and can be a global leader when it comes to innovative and creativity. Financial services, of course, and we've had real difficulties for that, but equally with energy and others. But my point, to some extent, is why say that we want to do that as a country of 5 million, rather than saying, could the first challenge not be that we want to lead the United Kingdom for this, and then actually use that to be on the platform? I personally think that the United Kingdom's position on some of the climate change objectives are there because of the Scottish executive as then was and the Scottish Parliament taking a lead. And I think that's something that we should be having as a pride of honour, that we actually can lead the United Kingdom. What I find quite stultifying is to saying that if we don't agree with what other parts of the United Kingdom are doing, then the response to that is to separate ourselves from them rather than to lead them. I actually think that it provides a great opportunity. And if it means then we can fit in with Kieran's position, then actually, and the gentleman at the back, which I agree with very strongly, that's a very strong platform of which to build on.
Right, question here. Last one.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on what one of the arguments you're putting is better representation for Scotland. And I have to say that I feel I've never been very well represented, but I don't believe I'm going to be any better represented just if Scotland was independent.
You mean
the issue is more about
in Edinburgh or in international organisations?
In terms of elections and that you vote and actually the people you vote for are having some say in things. The issue seems to be more about electoral reform than actually a requirement that Scotland goes independent. And I'd love to hear the panel's view on whether, in terms of a contribution to the world, actually a more responsive electoral system, so more people actually feel they have their say, is a better contribution to the world than fragmentation.
Well, one of the big changes since devolution is that we've seen reform to the electoral system, both to the Scottish Parliament and to local government, so we have different electoral systems to both. So both the Scottish Parliament and local government is now more reflective of the views of the electorate in wards and in parliamentary constituencies. But you're right to say that doesn't necessarily mean that you get who you want representing you, nor that people perhaps take the political lead. The electoral system doesn't provide that. But I suspect on this at least we will agree as people who support proportional representation that we do need to do everything that we can to make sure that our Parliament is more representative, and that's why the Scottish Parliament has more political parties than is the case elsewhere. I think the fact that local government, we have multi-member wards, means that you tend to be represented at least by one councillor who we voted for, but people in public life always need to work to improve representation. It is no guarantee of itself, and controversially I would say here, independence is no guarantee of itself that we will have the answer to every question, but we will have the tools at our disposal to make a better go of it. And to answer the lady's question about in relation to renewable energies, for me there's a very simple difference about how we can deal with things. We're very lucky. We have won on the natural lottery twice. So Scotland is still the largest oil producer of the European Union, not that we can see tremendous benefits from that. In comparison to our neighbours in Norway, who now have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world because they have saved from their oil wealth, so future generations will benefit ad infinitum. But because we've won twice in the natural lottery, and Scotland with 1% of Europe's population, but 25% of all the renewable resources, if we choose to pursue that, we have an amazing opportunity for the future. But to be able to manage all of that in terms of taxation, regulation, and the aspiration to be a global leader in renewables, we need to be a sovereign state to do that properly. Another reason to vote yes.
That's we'll take that as your closing statement, Angus. Kieran, Prendergast, I'm just going to ask the two of you, and then I'll ask Jeremy to make his kind of closing remark, what you make of what you've heard.
You want to go first?
I'll go first.
Well, I'm still in my ignorance somewhat baffled, because as an ignorant outsider, it seems to me that Scotland's already got most, if not all, of the benefits of independence, while staying within the comfortable womb of the United Kingdom, and the benefits of actually severing that link appear to me as an outsider to be questionable. But I am aware, it seemed to me that as we construct larger political units in Europe, the European Union gets bigger and bigger, so that seems to have acted as a catalyst for a move towards greater emphasis on regionalism. And you've seen it in Spain, you've seen it in the United Kingdom already, you've seen it elsewhere, and I assume that this is that this movement is a bit part of that. The only thing I would say is, you need to vote with your heads, not your hearts, no matter how irritating the English may be.
Urko, from a Spanish perspective, a Basque perspective, what do you make of what you've heard?
I know what I will do in my Basque country, and I will vote for yes, of course. I think that the differences are huge. We come much more from a perspective of grievances and years of violence and years of repression. I was born and grow up in an area that we could reflect as the bauxite or the false road. So my perspective will be much more of the heart than of the mind. I remember a Nationalist Party member saying that if we will be independent, we will eat cabbage for 100 years. And we say, of course, we will eat cabbage for 100 years before that continue being Spanish. So that's completely different.
You couldn't be clearer. Jeremy Purvis, last word from you.
I'll gloss over the fact that as Tessa's former MSP, I'll gloss over the fact that she was never satisfied with the representation that she got. Thank you very much. But apart from what a Boris welcome, what a Boris hospitality welcome. I think over the rest of our lifetimes in the world, I think part of the thing that is one of the more challenging aspects will be of how communities are brought together in peaceful ways that are able to share power and look at some of the very complex social needs that are in the future. I don't think that Scotland's contribution to that debate would be showing how you can divide unions together. I suspect that I may be with the majority of people in Scotland, but we'll find out next year that we don't want to break up Britain, but we want Britain to work better. And I think one of the aspects which I will be certainly pushing for, which is quite interesting on a global field as well, within different parts of the world, is that the solution to fixing political problems and structural problems around the world is not to continually to divide statehood, but actually to make sure that institutions on behalf of their people work better. And if it means that we look at the opportunity of the referendum of putting a positive case for strengthening the Parliament, making it standing in its own right, not a creature of Westminster, all of the elements that I've written on Devo Plus, which is a plug for the proposals I've been putting forward, or federalism, or a Gladstonian Home Rule. I think that that is a concept that is one of the good things that's curiously 19th century, which will be relevant for the 22nd century. I think the 19th century concept of statehood is increasingly no longer relevant and absolutely will not be relevant in the 22nd century.
You've all made your points extremely clearly, and if I may say so, with admirable brevity, on most occasions anyway. And I'd like to, Kieran, Urko, Angus and Jeremy, on your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much.